When we look at humanity's timeline, the official story presents a clear and relatively short journey. A little over 6,000 years ago, the first known cities, organized states, and writing emerge, marking the beginning of what we call civilization. But when we remember that Homo sapiens has inhabited this planet for at least 300,000 years, an uncomfortable question arises. What happened during the other 95% of that long existence? Was all that time filled only by small hunter-gatherer societies living in constant repetition? Or is it possible that entire chapters of our trajectory were erased by time? Civilizations that flourished and disappeared even before the Neolithic. This possibility, though unlikely in the eyes of traditional archaeology, opens a space for reflection that questions the linearity of human progress. After all, the planet is a relentless editor. Erosion, earthquakes, glaciations, tectonic plate movements, and the simple rhythm of the tides tirelessly rewrite Earth's surface. Modern megacities, if abandoned today, might leave no clear traces even after a few thousand years. Imagine then what would remain after 100 millennia: steel corroded into dust, plastics fragmented into dispersed micro-debris, skyscrapers reduced to indistinct sand. The material record is more fragile than we like to admit. The absence of evidence does not necessarily mean the absence of existence. This fragility invites us to reconsider. Perhaps it isn't absurd to think that complex societies rose in remote times, only to be swallowed by geological silence. When we think about what defines a civilization, our minds immediately summon images of stone temples, paved streets, imposing fortifications, and libraries packed with records. However, when we apply that same filter to periods as distant as 100,000 years ago, we risk committing a mistake of perspective. What survives to reach us are the most resistant materials: stone, bone, pottery, and from them we reconstruct narratives. But what if there existed an advanced way of life that relied on resources that did not withstand the action of time? Sophisticated plant-based textiles, organic composites, or even bioengineered living systems that replaced what we today recognize as technology. All of this could have vanished completely, leaving nothing but chemical traces or patterns of environmental alteration that we have not yet learned to interpret. Thus, the absence of marble columns or metal tools does not invalidate the hypothesis. It only shows how our expectations of proof are shaped by our own way of existing. This bias of primitivism projects onto our ancestors an image of inevitable backwardness, as if only we today had brains complex enough to invent, plan, and transform the world. But neuroscience and genetic studies show that the brain of Homo sapiens 100,000 years ago already possessed practically the same capacities we have today: articulated language, abstract thought, detailed memory. The potential was there, even if external conditions were different. If we admit this, the question gains force. Why would it be impossible that somewhere on the planet, populations experimented with forms of social and technological organization we don't yet understand? Imagine vast coastal plains now submerged, where communities could have flourished in fertile, temperate regions. Imagine networks of settlements linked by paths, now swallowed by the ocean, or environmental management techniques that blend with natural formations. All of this is plausible, not probable, but plausible, and that margin of possibility is enough for the mystery to settle in and invite us to look at prehistory with new eyes. If we mentally step back to about 100,000 years before the present, the planet that unfolds before us is at once familiar and profoundly strange. Glaciations advanced and retreated in cycles that shaped entire landscapes. Sea levels were lower, revealing extensive coastal plains, and land bridges connected regions now separated by oceans. Beringia linked Siberia to Alaska, The Mediterranean had different shores, and vast areas that are now submerged were, at the time, fertile and habitable. These spaces could have been the true hearts of ancient populations, where life flourished under stable, abundant conditions. Yet with the rise of the waters after the end of the great ice ages, these territories disappeared beneath the ocean. What remained was submerged silence, where any vestiges lie inaccessible, hidden under layers of marine sediment. This geographical loss amplifies the sense of a gap. Perhaps we are looking at only a fraction of history, ignoring precisely the regions where more complex societies could have arisen. Conventional archaeology faces here an almost insoluble dilemma. How do we investigate what is inaccessible? Oceanic drilling, expeditions with submersible vehicles, sonar sweeps, all these techniques exist, but they're expensive and rarely applied when academic priorities fall on known sites on dry land. Thus, the sea becomes a kind of hermetic vault, guarding what could be the key to lost chapters of human history. Imagine entire coastal cities, villages built in fertile estuaries, trade routes crossing deltas now invisible. If something like this existed, each wave breaking on the beach might be covering a buried memory. The mystery deepens when we remember that many oral traditions and myths from different cultures speak of floods, sunken lands, drowned kingdoms. Perhaps they aren't merely spiritual metaphors, but recollections turned into myth by the force of time. Archaeology doesn't yet have definitive answers, but the lack of large-scale investigation at sea leaves open an enormous field of possibilities. When we look at the official chronology, there's an intriguing discrepancy that rarely receives due attention. Anatomically modern humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, but what we call organized civilization, with cities, writing, and the state, is little more than 6 millennia old. This contrast leaves a hiatus of nearly 300,000 years, filled, according to the traditional model, only by nomadic groups, small villages, and cultures that would have slowly advanced to the point of developing agriculture. But is that the only possible interpretation? What if, within that vast interval, there were bursts of complex organization, societal experiments reaching unimaginable levels of sophistication that collapsed without leaving obvious records? This hypothesis is not accepted by the academic mainstream, but it exposes an important vulnerability, the very notion of linearity in human progress. The absence of solid evidence should not be mistaken for evidence of absence. The issue becomes even more provocative when we consider the intrinsic fragility of any material record over 100,000 years. Imagine, for instance, a modern city like New York or São Paulo, abandoned today. In a few hundred years, bridges would rust and collapse, skyscrapers would become indistinguishable piles of rubble, and plastics would degrade into dispersed particles. After 10,000 years, it would be almost impossible to identify, without directed excavations, that a bustling metropolis once stood there. Now extend this process to 100 millennia. Only subtle chemical marks in the soil might remain. Perhaps layers of fossilized pollution, unusual variations in sediments. It isn't hard to conclude that if something similar had happened in the remote past, our chances of detection would be minimal. The planet doesn't preserve history like a museum. It recycles, erases, and rewrites constantly, leaving us only crumbs of information. This challenge becomes graver when we reflect on archaeological practice itself. What we call deep excavation is, most of the time, superficial compared to the scale of geological time. Archaeological research rarely goes beyond a few meters of depth because resources, time, and logistics are limited. The search is guided by hypotheses. We dig where we already expect to find something. This inevitably creates bias because we ignore vast regions that could harbor evidence of much older occupations. It's as if we were looking for books in an immense library, but always on the same familiar shelves. Modern tools such as shallow seismics, geophysical mapping, and even artificial intelligence applied to geological collections could open new paths, but they are still little used in investigations aimed at deep prehistories. Thus, the possibility remains open that we are merely scratching the surface of a past more complex than we suppose. When we include the oceans in this equation, the mystery reaches another scale. We now know sea level can rise by more than 100 meters in glacial and interglacial cycles, covering coastal areas that in other epochs were fertile and densely populated. It's reasonable to suppose that if human communities sought abundant lands, coasts would have been prime locations. But today, these territories lie submerged, accessible only through costly operations with multi-beam sonar, bathymetric LiDAR, or deep-diving submersibles. There, perhaps, rest the remains of settlements, buried artificial channels, occupation patterns we will only confirm when underwater archaeology gains priority. The paradox is that we know where to look, the ancient continental shelves, but we rarely have the resources to explore them. Thus, the coasts of yesteryear remain a kind of drowned world, guarding secrets that may never surface. It's no coincidence that so many peoples, separated by oceans and millennia, carry in their collective memory narratives of deluges and sunken lands. The stories of Noah, of Deucalion in Greece, of Australian Aboriginal myths, and even Plato's famous Atlantis seem to echo the same recollection. Inhabited territories that disappeared under the waters. Of course, myths are transformed, mingle with spiritual symbols, and are shaped by cultural contexts. But it's also possible that these accounts are the poetic transfiguration of real experiences transmitted orally across generations. Coastal peoples who saw their homes swallowed by rising seas may have crystallized this trauma into mythical narratives. Thus, when we cross-reference archaeology, geology, and oral tradition, we open an interesting window. Perhaps popular imagination preserves fragments of chapters of history that science has not yet managed to prove. The same reasoning applies to discoveries that seem not to fit the accepted timeline. So-called out-of-place artifacts always spark fascination and controversy. The Antikythera mechanism, for example, dated to a little more than 2,000 years ago, revealed a degree of technological sophistication that seemed improbable for that period. Although it belongs to a relatively recent era, its discovery serves as a reminder that complexity can arise, vanish, and then be forgotten. Now imagine if something similar had existed tens of thousands of years ago. Calculating instruments, engineering techniques, advanced knowledge, all lost to the erosion of time. Without a clear archaeological context, any such find would be discredited, seen as fraud or geological coincidence. Therefore, the issue is not only to find proof, but to recognize it when it appears. Our own resistance to accepting hypotheses outside the prevailing paradigm may be yet another obstacle to revealing what hides in the deep layers of history. There is also the intriguing hypothesis that an advanced civilization in the remote past did not follow the same material path we did. Instead of raising pyramids or smelting tons of iron, it could have adopted a form of technology almost invisible to us, based on biodegradable materials, biochemical processes, or clean local energy. Imagine structures erected with plant-based composites of extremely high strength that decomposed within a few generations after abandonment. Imagine transportation systems that did not depend on metals, but on cleverly transformed organic resources. If such a society existed, its archaeological footprint would be minimal, almost impossible to distinguish from nature. Knowledge might have been embedded in living systems, like forests managed to fulfill functions we now assign to machines. A civilization like that could have flourished and vanished without leaving visible traces, blending into the very environment. This line of reasoning leads to a profound reflection. To what extent are we capable of recognizing a technology that does not resemble our own? If we come across a carved stone, we easily identify it as a human artifact. But what if the vestige is a fossilized organic polymer or a network of chemical patterns in the soil, resembling natural formations? Our criteria for recognition are limited by what we expect to find. It's possible we have passed, during archaeological expeditions, by signs of technological practices we simply did not know how to interpret. Beyond iron and concrete, perhaps past civilizations used codes, materials, and languages that were lost not because they disappeared, but because we can no longer translate them. This idea reminds us that archaeology is not only a science of excavation, but also of imagination. We must learn to look at the unexpected with fresh eyes. As we reflect on alternative paths to complexity, we realize our definition of civilization may be biased. We usually look for smelted metals, fossilized plastics, or monumental ruins. But what if past societies didn't need any of that? They may have achieved sophistication through advanced ceramics, plant composites, resilient textiles, dispersed settlements rather than dense cities, and even infrastructures, integrated into the landscape itself, invisible to our modern eyes. In such a scenario, progress wouldn't translate into pyramids or walls, but into subtle ways of manipulating the environment. Irrigation channels indistinguishable from natural rivers, forests shaped over centuries, soils enriched that we now call terra preta, without fully understanding their origin. Perhaps we confuse artifacts with stones and buildings with hills because our perception is limited by what fits our civilization checklist. But if a society like this truly flourished, we must also think about how it could have disappeared. Known history shows that collapses can be sudden and devastating. A super eruption like Toba's about 74,000 years ago spread ash across the globe and triggered a volcanic winter. An asteroid impact, rarer still, would have equally catastrophic effects. Abrupt climate changes, ecological collapses, or pandemics could have reduced entire populations within generations. If knowledge wasn't recorded on durable media, it would quickly be lost. In 2 or 3 centuries, a highly advanced community could regress to basics, concerned only with survival. Just as we've seen in more recent imperial falls, Egypt, Rome, the Bronze Age kingdoms, but on a much larger scale, it is plausible that the very memory of a sophisticated world dissolved into deep time. One of the greatest problems in investigating possibly lost civilizations is the so-called gap problem. After 100,000 years, even real artifacts end up looking natural. Without adequate archaeological context, a polished stone blade can be mistaken for a common rock fragment. A chemical alteration in the soil can be attributed to volcanism rather than human activity. This gap creates a vicious circle. If we lack context, we don't recognize the evidence. If we don't recognize it, we don't investigate. It's like trying to reconstruct a book from a few smudged letters scattered without order across charred pages. To overcome this barrier, researchers suggest that a single isolated find is not enough. What's needed is a package of converging evidence, multiple lines of proof that together point to a non-natural origin. Only then would it be possible to break the inertia of skepticism and make room for bolder interpretations. This reasoning gains strength when we think about the power of singular events to redefine history. One well-aimed disaster is enough to erase centuries of advancement. A colossal eruption, a cosmic impact, or even an abrupt climate shift could topple production systems, sever supply routes, and disorganize entire social structures. Within a few generations, technical knowledge would cease to be transmitted, reducing sophisticated communities to the daily struggle for survival. Examples from recent history confirm this fragility. The collapse of the Bronze Age, still shrouded in mystery, showed how interconnected societies can crumble almost simultaneously leaving only ruins and uncertainties. If this happened just over 3,000 years ago, why couldn't it have occurred in far more distant times, on scales we cannot even imagine? The deep silence of the ages may hide not only the traces of a civilization, but also the echo of its abrupt end. While stones, metals, and objects degrade, there is another form of memory that endures: genetics. Even without visible ruins, genes can carry echoes of ancient populations. This is how we discovered the presence of Neanderthals and Denisovans in our DNA, revealing encounters and admixtures that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. However, this genetic information alone tells us nothing about those groups' technological or cultural level. We don't know whether they lived in simple huts or developed organizational techniques that were lost along with them. What genetic vestiges show us is that humanity's history is far more intricate than the linear narrative suggests, and that ghost populations exist whose presence we deduce only indirectly. And what if among those populations there were also heirs of more complex societies that disappeared without leaving material traces but left invisible marks in our biology? The discovery today of a pre-Neolithic advanced civilization would not be merely an archaeological event. It would be an intellectual earthquake. It would force us to rewrite our chronologies, revise models of cultural evolution, and rethink the very foundations of the story we tell about ourselves. The consequences would spread far beyond academia. Religions, national identities, and political narratives would need to reposition themselves before the idea that we were not the first to shape the world. At the same time, a unique opportunity would open to learn from the successes and failures of societies that may have faced challenges similar to ours, such as climate change or ecological pressures. But there would also be obvious risks. The race to control the find, disputes between countries, economic interests trying to monopolize knowledge. A discovery of this magnitude would require open, multilateral protocols so that the legacy would not again be lost to oblivion or manipulated by the interests of a few. Given this possibility, what emerges is a lesson in temporal humility. We are not necessarily the pinnacle of human history, but only another chapter in a vast book of which we know only a few pages. This perspective dissolves the triumphalism of thinking that current civilization is the species' final destination. On the contrary, it suggests our responsibility is even greater. If other societies flourished and disappeared without leaving clear traces, what guarantees ours will be different? This reflection invites us to plan not only for the next decades, but for the next millennia. What do we want to survive of us? What kind of legacy will we leave beyond dust and ruins? Perhaps the greatest learning lies in recognizing that our permanence depends on the capacity to think intergenerationally, preserving not only data and materials, but also the ecosystems that sustain life. And it is precisely at this point that the argument gains a decisive nuance. Absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. Archaeology is still far from exploring the planet in all its depth, both on land and in the seas. Often, old collections remain forgotten in storage, with fragments that could reveal unprecedented histories if reinterpreted with new techniques. It is possible that clues are literally before us, but go unnoticed because they don't fit current interpretive models. The challenge is to broaden the search criteria, adopt rigorous falsification methods, and at the same time, keep an open mind to recognize unexpected patterns. This combination of healthy skepticism and scientific imagination is perhaps the only path to decipher hidden chapters of our own history. But after all, why insist on imagining this hidden past? The answer may lie less in the desire to discover spectacular ruins and more in the need to recalibrate our sense of risk and resilience. When we accept the possibility that advanced societies may have existed and disappeared without leaving clear traces, we are forced to admit that our own civilization is not immune to a similar fate. This leads us to think long-term. How can we record our presence in ways that withstand deep time? How can we create archives, structures and systems that survive not just centuries, but tens of thousands of years? This exercise in imagination is, at the same time, a practical call to invest in long-term science, in preserved geo-archives, in technologies capable of keeping alive the memory of who we were, even in the face of Earth's inevitable erosion. There is also an irresistible philosophical component. To imagine a lost civilization is, in a sense, to imagine ourselves in another guise. What makes us unique is not only our current technology, but the capacity to project the future and reconstruct the past. By reflecting on what may have been erased, we perceive the fragility of what we consider permanent. Pyramids, skyscrapers, satellites, all seem gigantic on our life scale, yet fragile before the geological calendar. This awareness need not paralyze us. On the contrary, it can inspire us to build more consciously, leaving legacies that matter more than monuments. Perhaps the true value of imagining a hidden chapter of history is not in finding definitive proof, but in awakening in us the notion that we are part of a much larger cycle in which each generation writes a page that may be preserved or erased. One point we rarely consider is the role of geology itself as an agent of forgetting. Earth is not static. It moves, breathes, and reshapes its face in unceasing cycles. Mountains rise, oceans open, deserts swallow entire forests. Cities erected on fertile plains could, in a few tens of millennia, be covered by sediments, turned into layers of rock, or simply vanish into the rift of a moving tectonic plate. This process is so relentless that even present-day structures like dams or skyscrapers would struggle to survive deep time. In other words, if a civilization flourished 100,000 years ago, Earth would have had more than enough time to recycle it completely. Only the subtlest signs would remain: atypical chemical concentrations, irregular sedimentary patterns, layers of soot or minerals altered artificially, and it is in these almost invisible details that we could find the most intriguing clues. It is in this context that the so-called Silurian hypothesis arises, proposed by modern scientists as a serious provocation. If another civilization had existed millions of years before us, how could we detect it? The surprising answer: we wouldn't look for ruins, but for geochemical signatures. Long-lived synthetic compounds, alterations in the carbon cycle, unusual radioactive isotopes, sedimentary layers with persistent pollutants. These would be the true markers of technological activity over millions of years. Adapting this logic to our scenario, a civilization from 100,000 years ago could have left similar traces, even if all artifacts had disappeared. The challenge is to distinguish such signals from natural processes like volcanism or periods of oceanic anoxia. But the very formulation of this hypothesis forces us to broaden our view. Perhaps the signals are already in ice cores, marine sediments, or rocks from ancient basins, waiting to be interpreted with a different key. When we speak of the fingerprints of a lost civilization, we cannot expect untouched temples or perfectly preserved tools. What can truly survive deep time are indirect traces, unusual metal concentrations in sediments, minerals formed by high-temperature fusion, or even fossilized microplastics in ancient deposits. These vestiges would function as chemical signatures, small anomalies that stand out from the natural record. The problem is that many of these markers have geological analogues. A carbon spike in sediments may signal industrial activity, but it might also have been caused by a large volcanic eruption. An unusual concentration of certain isotopes may suggest mining, but it can also result from tectonic processes. The task, therefore, is not only to find something different, but to build a network of multiple, convergent, consistent evidence. Only then can we begin to separate what is natural from what could be cultural. This brings us to a practical challenge: where to look. Some regions offer much more favorable preservation conditions than others. Stable sedimentary basins, cold, dry deserts, deep lakes, and buried continental shelves are environments capable of preserving records for tens of thousands of years. In these areas, sediment layers accumulate like pages in a book, quietly recording the chemical and biological changes that occurred at the surface. If a pre-Neolithic civilization left traces, it is likely they are in these natural archives. The problem is that such investigations demand time, resources, and above all, new questions. Science finds only what it looks for, and until now, we have rarely searched for signs of such ancient societies. Perhaps in the future, geological and archaeological expeditions will integrate sophisticated chemical and physical methods to comb through these regions. Until then, the idea that we are faced with a closed archive keeps the mystery alive and stirs the imagination. Another factor complicating this investigation is the practical limitation of deep archaeology. Digging down a few meters already requires time, labor, and resources. Descending tens or hundreds of meters in search of much older contexts is something rarely done. Scientific funding tends to favor more conservative hypotheses, promising quick results and safe publications. This creates an inevitable bias. We look where it's cheaper and more predictable to dig, not where the mystery may truly lie. Even when we find anomalies, the natural tendency is to interpret them within the prevailing paradigm, avoiding bold conclusions. The consequence is that there may already be evidence discovered, but silenced because it is out of context or doesn't fit conventional categories. It's a kind of institutionalized blindness in which excessive caution can prevent us from seeing the extraordinary. To overcome these barriers, new technologies offer promising paths. High-resolution geophysics can reveal buried structures without extensive excavations. Directed drilling in sedimentary basins can reach layers untouched for hundreds of thousands of years. Artificial intelligence can analyze patterns in existing geological and archaeological collections, identifying anomalies previously overlooked. However, even with these tools, there is always the risk of confirmation bias, seeing technology where there is only unusual geology. Therefore, prudence must walk hand in hand with imagination. We need to develop clear criteria to distinguish between natural processes and possible cultural traces. Only thus can deep archaeology advance without falling into unfounded speculation, yet without losing the courage to consider out-of-the-ordinary hypotheses. After all, investigating the possibility of lost civilizations is, above all, the practice of science. At the frontier between the known and the unknown. Among all possible scenarios, perhaps the most fascinating is that of the drowned world. Imagine vast, fertile, temperate coastal plains occupied by human communities tens of thousands of years ago. These lands were the best places to live, close to the sea, rich in fish and resources, endowed with rivers that brought fresh water and natural transport. But as the ice ages ended and polar ice caps melted, sea level rose by more than 100 meters, slowly swallowing these regions. What were once villages, ports, or even regional trade centers became ocean floors. Today, accessing these areas would require multi-beam sonar, submersible vehicles, and bathymetric mapping technology. But investment in underwater archaeology is still scarce, which means these civilizational hearts remain invisible, hidden beneath the waves. It's as if an essential part of humanity's book had been torn out and thrown to the bottom of the sea. When we think of this, flood myths take on a new dimension. They can be seen as memories transformed into sacred stories, passed from generation to generation until becoming legend. Peoples who saw their homes sink beneath the waters may have crystallized this trauma into symbolic narratives. The famous story of Atlantis, told by Plato, may be only a philosophical metaphor, but it may also carry echoes of real events lived by communities that lost entire territories to the sea. Likewise, oral traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples speak of coastal lands now submerged, and recent studies show that some of these narratives may have roots in events over 10,000 years ago. This suggests that human memory can preserve facts over surprisingly long time scales, even if wrapped in layers of imagination. Thus, each myth can be a key, not proof, but an invitation to look at the past more carefully. Throughout history, some controversial finds have served as reminders that sophistication can arise in unexpected eras. The Antikythera mechanism, for instance, turned out to be a complex analog computer capable of calculating astronomical positions with impressive precision. Its existence in the ancient Greek world shows that even in periods well studied, we are still surprised by technologies that seemed improbable. If that happened just 2 millennia ago, why not consider that something similar could have existed tens of thousands of years earlier? The difference is that the farther back in time, the lower the chance of preservation. Artifacts made of wood, plant-based textiles, or composite materials could have disintegrated completely, leaving only unrecognizable fragments. The question is not whether something survived, but whether we are prepared to recognize it when we find it. Without an open mind, any out-of-context discovery risks being dismissed as fraud or mere geological curiosity. This reflection leads us to another crucial point: the possibility that an ancient civilization followed a technological path radically different from ours. We are accustomed to associating advancement with metallurgy, electricity, and concrete, but that is only one specific model of development. A society could have been based on biodegradable materials of extremely high quality, or even on biochemical processes integrated into the environment. Instead of skyscrapers and power plants, it could have shaped entire forests to fulfill social and energy functions, creating living infrastructure that blended with nature. Such a civilization would leave very few recognizable traces, perhaps only subtle alterations in ecosystems or genetic patterns of domesticated plants. To us, looking at the past through lenses shaped by industrialization, such signs would go unnoticed. This possibility challenges us to broaden not only where and how much we dig, but also how we interpret what we find. If we consider this hypothesis of a civilization that left few material traces, we must also question our own perceptual limitations. Our criteria for technology are shaped by what we know: electricity, steel, concrete, engines. But what if sophistication had manifested in forms we don't recognize as technological? Communication networks based on biochemical signals, organic polymers that fell apart in a few decades, or even information systems embedded in the genetic patterns of domesticated species. To our modern eyes, these vestiges would look natural, invisible, irrelevant. It is possible we have already passed by them in archaeological excavations or soil studies, without attributing due value. Though speculative, this idea reminds us that the past is not a mirror of the present. Recognizing this is essential, so we don't confuse unfamiliarity with lack of evidence. After all, what we cannot identify may be precisely what carries the most intriguing answers. The very diversity of possible paths challenges the notion that civilization must follow a fixed script. Perhaps ancient societies did not raise pyramids or empires, but developed complexity in dispersed modular structures based on local cooperation. The excess centralization we associate with urbanization may not have been necessary. It is plausible to imagine communities interconnected by networks of symbolic and economic exchange without a monumental center. That would explain the scarcity of grand ruins. Sophistication would be distributed in everyday life, not concentrated in palaces or temples. This form of organization would resemble ecosystems more than modern states, functioning like a collective organism, resilient and adaptable. To future archaeologists, without proper context, such societies would look like isolated populations when, in fact, they may have represented an advanced stage of social and technological experimentation. This perspective broadens our imagination about what may have existed and reinforces that our view of progress may be too narrow. If we accept the idea that past civilizations could have followed different paths, we must also consider the scenarios of disappearance. Known history shows that even complex societies are vulnerable to catastrophes. The Roman Empire fell within a few generations. The Maya civilization collapsed after centuries of splendor. The Bronze Age kingdoms disappeared almost simultaneously for reasons still debated. Now imagine this process on a much older and more extreme scale. A super eruption like the Toba volcano, spreading ash across the entire planet, could have reduced human populations to small, scattered groups. Pandemics, ecological collapses, or even large-scale conflicts could likewise have erased entire communities. In 2 or 3 centuries, accumulated knowledge could be forgotten, leaving only fragmented memories converted into myths. The ensuing silence would make us believe nothing ever existed, when in fact something flourished and crumbled without leaving lasting witnesses. What is most unsettling is that even in the face of such possible collapse scenarios, local resilience could have ensured the survival of small human nuclei. These groups, isolated and weakened, might have preserved traces of the original culture, but without the material or demographic means to sustain prior complexity. Over time, knowledge would dilute, transforming into symbolic traditions or fragmented practices difficult to recognize thousands of years later. This mechanism would explain why we find hints of sophisticated behaviors, such as advanced rock art or ingenious hunting techniques, in very ancient periods, but no clear vestiges of urbanization. Collapse would have erased the structure, yet left scattered seeds, echoes we now interpret as isolated flashes of ingenuity. Perhaps these are not merely isolated sparks of human cleverness, but fragments of a larger heritage reduced to essentials by the devastating force of deep time. If there is one thing deep time teaches us, it is that nothing remains unchanged. What seems solid today, cities, technologies, monuments, can turn to dust in a matter of millennia. For this reason, some researchers argue that we should search for packages of evidence rather than isolated artifacts. A strange fragment can be dismissed as a geological accident, but several chemical, sedimentary, and archaeological anomalies converging in the same layer tell a story far harder to ignore. This method, integrating geochemistry, sedimentology, archaeology, and even paleogenetics, may open the way for bolder hypotheses. By crossing multiple disciplines, we can differentiate what is natural chance from what may have been the result of intelligent activity. It is delicate work, demanding both scientific rigor and a willingness to face skepticism. But without such an approach, any trace of civilization prior to the Neolithic will remain invisible, buried beneath disbelief. One of the most discussed scenarios in this context is the civilizational reset caused by singular devastating events. Imagine a society that, after centuries of stability, is struck by an implacable natural disaster, an asteroid impact, a mega tsunami, or an abrupt climate change. The collapse of its supply networks would melt social complexity within a few generations. Technical knowledge, lacking means to be preserved on durable media, would quickly disappear. What would remain would be minimal vestiges, a layer of ash in sediments, a sudden change. In fossilized pollen, signs of abandonment in certain regions. This is exactly what we see on a smaller scale in known historical collapses. Now project this process back 100,000 years, and it becomes easy to understand why nothing survived. The planet would have recycled the signals, and we would look back believing emptiness was the only reality. As we widen this reflection, we realize even our own time could be reinterpreted in the future in surprising ways. If, for some reason, humanity disappeared today, what would remain of us in 100,000 years? Satellites in orbit would likely have re-entered the atmosphere and disintegrated. Our cities would be reduced to dust, absorbed by Earth's natural cycles. What might persist would be chemical vestiges, layers of fossilized plastic, residues of fossil fuels, radioisotopes from nuclear tests. These would be the markers denouncing our passage, even if no building remained standing. Seen from this angle, it is possible to imagine that something similar may have happened before. Another civilization may have left its own chemical traces that we now confuse with natural phenomena. Soil keeps memories more enduring than any monument. This perspective leads us to a curious paradox. Perhaps we have already found hints of ancient societies, but simply do not recognize them as such. Geochemical anomalies, unusual mineral deposits, odd patterns in sediment layers, all may have natural origins, but they could also result from ancient human activity. Interpretation depends on the lens we apply. If we are not looking for prior civilizations, we will hardly see signs of them. It's like looking at an abstract painting. What we see depends on the questions we bring to it. For this reason, some scientists advocate applying new methodologies, such as mass spectrometry on ancient samples, to identify possible artificial signatures hidden amid the natural landscape. The difficulty is that the boundary between solid science and speculation is thin, and skepticism often smothers curiosity. Even so, keeping this possibility open is essential so we do not miss clues that might be right before our eyes. Among many speculative scenarios, one deserves special attention: a civilization that developed forms of technology invisible to our contemporary gaze. Think of biochemical networks capable of storing information, organic materials outperforming steel yet degrading within a few generations, or communication forms not based on electricity, but on subtle biological processes. If something like this existed, the artifacts we seek today, stone blades, metal tools, monumental ruins, would be useless for detecting it. We would be looking at the past through the wrong filter, like someone searching for music in a painting. This possibility broadens our perception. Perhaps what we understand as civilization is only one version among many possible, and perhaps there have already been paths as sophisticated as ours but radically different in form and expression. This line of thought also reminds us that archaeology is, to a large extent, a science of interpretation. When we excavate an object or a soil layer, meaning does not arise automatically, we must assign it. This means that if we lack categories to recognize certain signals, they go unnoticed. It is possible that remote civilizations left clues we confuse with natural formations, or that we classify incorrectly. Imagine, for example, advanced ceramics reduced to dust and confused with common minerals, or a fossilized plant-based composite identified only as wood. The risk of invisibility is immense. Therefore, speculation about hidden civilizations is not just an exercise in imagination, but also a critique of how we look at the past. It reminds us that lack of recognition does not mean lack of existence. Ultimately, perhaps the greatest mystery is not what is missing, but what is already before us, waiting for another reading. As we Imagine these alternative paths. We must also reflect on how such societies might have organized themselves. Perhaps they did not build megacities, but structured smaller communities connected by cooperation networks that dispensed with large urban centers. Instead of population concentrations behind walls or in temples, there may have been a more balanced distribution, almost invisible to us. That would explain why we find few urbanization vestiges in remote periods, but dispersed signs of ingenuity, sophisticated rock paintings, large-scale fire management, planned use of natural resources. These populations could have cultivated complexity without material ostentation in a decentralized way, like a living organism spreading through multiple points without depending on a single heart. To modern eyes accustomed to seeking pyramids or skyscrapers as symbols of civilization, such a society would pass easily unnoticed. This possibility forces us to reconsider what we understand by progress. We believe humanity's path is ascendant, always toward more technology, more control, and more monuments. But what if true advancement for an ancient civilization lay in living in harmony with the environment, leaving few lasting traces? In that case, what looks like absence to us, the lack of ruins, metal artifacts, or grand constructions, could, in fact, be evidence of a highly sophisticated way of life, sustainable and integrated with nature. Such a civilization might have reached levels of balance we have not yet achieved, and precisely for that reason disappeared with almost no visible footprints. The contrast is disturbing. While we worry about the indelible mark we leave on the planet, they may have chosen, consciously or not, to vanish almost without a trace. Thinking about the reasons for the disappearance of such a civilization, we inevitably return to great natural events. Earth is an unstable stage, subject to colossal eruptions, abrupt climate changes, and cosmic impacts that alter entire ecosystems within years. A single super-eruption could devastate harvests on a continental scale. A medium-sized asteroid could trigger global fires and unimaginable tsunamis. Even highly resilient societies would not be immune to such shocks. Most striking is that the loss would not be only material but also cultural. In 2 or 3 generations, knowledge not transmitted could disappear almost completely. We have already seen this in recent historical collapses, such as the Bronze Age, when advanced techniques of metallurgy and writing were lost for centuries. Now extend this to 100,000 years. The disappearance of an entire civilization could leave only scattered, ambiguous traces. But erasure need not come only from nature. Internal conflicts, prolonged wars, or even an ecological crisis caused by over-exploitation could have corroded the foundations of ancient societies. If imagining sunken cities is difficult, imagining ruins intentionally destroyed, abandoned, and overtaken by vegetation is even more so. The result would be the same. In a few generations, only grass-covered hills, confused with natural formations. Most disturbing is to consider that our own civilization may be subject to the same fate. Looking back, we might be seeing not only the emptiness of an uncertain time, but also the mirror of our possible future. After all, if others have flourished and disappeared, what guarantees we will not follow the same cycle? The reflection is not only archaeological, but existential. Are we prepared for our legacy to survive geological oblivion? Amid so many uncertainties, genetics emerges as one of the few tools capable of illuminating the deep past. DNA studies have already revealed surprising encounters and mixtures, such as the presence of Neanderthal and Denisovan genes in US modern Homo sapiens. These vestiges show we are not a pure and isolated lineage, but the result of multiple interactions over millennia. Still, DNA cannot tell us whether those populations mastered complex agricultural techniques, raised large structures, or cultivated sophisticated social organization. What it does show is that humanity's history is far more intricate than linear models suggest. Some studies even speak of ghost populations, entire lineages we know existed only because they left genetic traces, but with no associated archaeological record. This paradox opens an intriguing possibility. Perhaps part of the cultural heritage of forgotten societies is in some way encoded in us. If one day we were to find material proof of a pre-Neolithic advanced civilization, the impact would be profound. The chronology we learned in school would have to be rewritten, and cultural evolution models would be revised from end to end. It would not be merely an academic matter. Religions, traditions, and national identities would be challenged, forced to deal with the idea that we were not the first to organize the world in a complex way. At the same time, an unprecedented opportunity for learning would open. What sustainable technologies might they have developed? What social solutions could inspire us today? Inevitably, we must also think of risks. Geopolitical disputes over control of the find, economic exploitation, and even attempts to appropriate the narrative for ideological ends. The revelation of a hidden past would bring not only knowledge, but also ethical and political dilemmas. Perhaps, in the end, the bigger question is not whether we will find such proof, but how we will handle it when it appears. In the face of this possibility, what imposes itself is a lesson in humility. We usually think of our civilization as the inevitable peak of history, as if everything that came before were just a rudimentary prelude. But what if we are not the end point, only another chapter in a much vaster book? This idea forces us to look at ourselves with less triumphalism and more responsibility. If other societies, perhaps as ingenious as ours, flourished and disappeared without leaving clear traces, what guarantees ours will not share the same fate? Perhaps true wisdom lies in learning to think in intergenerational terms, planning not just for the next century, but for millennia ahead. The legacy we leave may be more important than any momentary achievement. This exercise of imagination also reminds us that absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. What we have found so far is only a limited crop, the product of the areas we have excavated and the hypotheses we have formed. Much of the planet remains untouched by high-resolution archaeological and geological investigations. Moreover, many collections already assembled have not yet been revisited with new techniques capable of identifying chemical signatures or once invisible microfossils. It is possible that clues are already in our hands, but were catalogued mistakenly or simply ignored because they do not fit the accepted models. Expanding how we search and interpret is essential because each sediment layer, each rock fragment, may contain more than it appears. The challenge is to maintain balance, not to fall into the trap of seeing civilization everywhere, but also not to close our eyes to signs we do not understand. If there is a practical reason to imagine a hidden past, it lies in how this exercise leads us to rethink the present. Accepting that entire chapters may have disappeared forces us to recognize the fragility of what we have built. Satellites, skyscrapers, digital networks, all of this, so monumental to our eyes, could unravel within a few generations of abandonment. This raises an urgent question. How can we ensure that part of our legacy survives deep time? Perhaps we should invest in truly durable materials, in records stored under extreme conditions, in archives distributed across the planet and even beyond it. The idea of preparing messages for the future is not only poetic, but strategic. If we want to be remembered in 100,000 years, we must think like geologists, not just like historians. In that sense, imagining past civilizations that vanished without a trace may be the warning we need to better plan our permanence. But beyond the practical dimension, there is also the philosophical. When we ask whether there were others before us, We are, in a way, looking into a distorted mirror. We do not seek only ruins. We seek to understand what it means to be human in a broader context. If we are neither the first nor the last, then our story is only part of something greater, perhaps a cycle that repeats in silence. This idea may be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Instead of seeing humanity as the final destination, we can see ourselves as temporary guardians of a legacy that must be passed on. Imagining that others have already walked similar paths invites us to reflect. Are we writing our story in a way that keeps it alive, or merely repeating mistakes that will doom us to the same oblivion? The mystery serves not only to feed curiosity, but to awaken responsibility. When we think about the future of archaeological research, we realize we may be only at the beginning of a new phase. Current tools already allow us to detect microscopic variations in soils and rocks, identify specific molecules in fossil layers, and map entire areas with remote technology. Imagine combining all this in a global effort dedicated to investigating not only the last tens of thousands of years, but much deeper periods. Such a project would require international cooperation, significant resources, and above all, a change in mindset. To stop looking only for what confirms what we already know and begin also to search for the unexpected. It is a scientific challenge, but also a cultural one, because it touches our self-image. Would we be ready to accept a discovery that shook the foundations of the historical narrative we have learned since childhood? At this point, risk and opportunity meet. A major discovery could spark a race for control, governments and corporations disputing territories, collections, and interpretations. At the same time, it could open space for a new stage in human knowledge, a chance to learn from the past in ways we cannot yet imagine. Perhaps we would find forgotten sustainable technologies or social models that could inspire solutions to current dilemmas. But we could also face dangerous temptations to manipulate the narrative to serve ideologies, to hide information for economic interest, to repeat the errors that led others to oblivion. Ultimately, the question is not only whether civilizations existed before us, but whether we are prepared to deal with that possibility. Because when we look back, we are also reflecting on what it means to move forward. Perhaps the greatest value in imagining hidden chapters of history lies not in the search for concrete proof, but in expanding our mental horizon. This speculation forces us to admit we do not know as much as we think, and that humanity's timeline may be more complex than the summarized version in textbooks. It invites us to contemplate the fragility of material memory and to recognize that deep time is a relentless editor. At the same time, it stirs a kind of scientific humility, the awareness that absence of evidence should not be interpreted as absolute certainty, but as room for investigation. As we reflect on this hypothesis, we discover that the real mystery is not only the past, but the way we interpret the present and project the future. This reflection also returns to us an essential question. What marks do we want to leave? If 100,000 years from now, someone excavates what remains of our civilization, will they find only fossilized plastic fragments, carbon spikes, and layers of radioisotopes? Will that be our legacy? Or will we be able to build more enduring records, symbols that cross millennia and convey not only what we produced, but also what we dreamed and felt? By imagining lost civilizations, we are led to look within ourselves, to rethink the meaning of our time on the planet. Perhaps the most important lesson is that true permanence does not lie in stone or metal, but in the capacity to inspire those who come after. Whether others existed before, we do not know, but we do know that today we have the power to choose what story we will leave for tomorrow. We thus arrive at the point where the mystery remains open, We do not know whether advanced civilizations existed before the Neolithic, nor whether we will ever find proof to confirm this hypothesis. But the mere possibility already transforms us. It widens our view of time, invites us to relativize certainties, and reminds us that humanity's history may be deeper and richer than we imagine. As we contemplate the silences of the archaeological record, we realize that the absence of ruins is not the absence of life. Perhaps entire chapters lie hidden beneath the oceans, dissolved in rocks or kept in soil layers we have not yet excavated. And perhaps we will never find them. But the search itself is an exercise in humility and curiosity, essential virtues for any society that wishes to understand its place in the cosmos. In the end, the question that remains is not only about the past, but about the future. If one day we are forgotten, if our cities turn to dust and our records dissolve, what impression will remain of us? Will we be only a brief flicker on the timeline, or will we manage to leave something that inspires, even if in distant echoes, those who come after? The mystery of possible lost civilizations invites us to imagine not only what has been, but what may yet be. It reminds us that we are passengers on a constantly changing planet, and that each choice made today can determine the reach of our memory tomorrow. We may never know whether there were others before us, but we do know we still have the chance to decide whether we will be remembered, or whether we will also become just another hidden chapter of history.